Of all the dynastic families in America's history, the Roosevelts are probably the best. I'd argue.
Well, they got some, I mean, you know, Kermit Roosevelt helped overthrow the Iranian government in the 50s and install the Shah of Iran and got toppled in 1979, so.
Oh, well, I'll take it back then.
He was a CIA operative. It was just like the worst of the CIA toppling governments. He was FDR's son, so. And his name was Kermit. It's like, which made him a great spy, you know, because who's going to suspect Kermit as a spy? All right. Well, the Jarvis. I mean, I'll put up the Jarvis, but basically, it's a lengthy look at through the Depression. The government was sort of worried about the health, the masculinity, the physical health of American men, and it's a whole bunch of different angles coming at how the American public, the American government, etc., were all sort of concerned that American men were both becoming soft because of all the modern appliances and things like that made things easier, cars instead of riding horses or whatever, but also that American men were becoming physically degraded by the poverty of the Depression, etc. So Jarvis is basically setting up this idea that concerns about masculinity were there really from World War I onward. The U.S. military was horrified to discover when they started drafting men into the military in 1918 or 1917, they were horrified to discover the level of health of the American public. That American men had a whole host of, everything from bad teeth to rickets to, polio to, and they're like, we can't get soldiers out of this. And one of the really horrifying things for them was that the Army decided for the first time in World War I to do IQ tests on all the recruits, and they were absolutely horrified at the average IQ level they were getting. And I will just point out that IQ tests were designed, they're supposed to measure intelligence, but what they're really measuring is education according to the standards of American higher education. So basically, the more educated you are, the higher your IQ is, because a lot of the questions are just simply, do you know this? And if you haven't had enough education, no, you won't. And so, it's math problems, and it's very much class related, meaning lower class people test worse on it. It's very much, cultural in ways that they didn't think it was cultural. They thought it was entirely neutral, but white people do better on it, but if you design the test differently, white people don't have a higher IQs than anybody else. But with this test, it's basically testing for knowledge that white people would have access to in the 30s or 40s or 20s or whatever. But anyway, this actually had a big impact on American education, that the US government began pouring money into public education as a result of those IQ tests on Army recruits in 1917, because they were horrified that the men they were going to make an army out of were both physically broken and ignorant. And so that wouldn't do. All right, let me talk about, I'll start World War II now, because what we need is another World War. We might keep getting on, but
both France and Germany said that if the U.S. goes after Greenland, that they'll deploy troops there.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it would trigger the NATO, what is it, clause 5 or whatever, which says that if somebody attacks a NATO country, that all the other NATO countries will mobilize to defend it.
I also hope that Russia basically was with the US is okay, they'll fight us here.
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but
Okay, you guys gotta tell me. I'm gonna be writing on the board, so I'm not gonna put the screen down. Is that better? Is that better? Or is that better?
oh my god.
Not that one. One, not two.
Yeah.
Which one's this?
One?
That's two.
It's 2, so that one's better? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to keep switching because some of my things are on paper and I need the top lamps, and some of them are on transparencies because I'm old school. This is a transparency, so we're getting the backlighting. Okay, so let me start World War II. Quick history of Japan, because you guys didn't get none of that. Japan has an interesting history, a really weird history. They were essentially a sort of a satellite little kingdom to China. They borrowed the Chinese script, and they borrowed Chinese religion, and etc. But they were a different culture. They were an island kingdom. But in the 1600s, Europeans began showing up and trading with Japan. And in particular, the Dutch were big about trading with Japan, but the Spanish were there, and the Portuguese, etc. And Christianity was introduced to Japan and began to spread pretty significantly. There were significant numbers of Japanese Christians. And this began to cause problems because the whole Japanese imperial political ideology was built on basically worshiping the emperor, not Jesus. And Japanese Christians began to seriously question whether they should be loyal to the emperor, etc. And so this began to cause significant problems. And the shogun, who was the guy who was ruling around the country, the emperor was a figurehead, he had no power. In 1624, the shogun decided to close Japan. They simply said it was illegal if you leave Japan and you can never come back, and it is illegal for anybody outside of Japan to come to Japan, unless they have specific permission from the emperor or the shogun. The only exception is that once a year, the Dutch were allowed to send a certain number of ships to an island off the coast of Japan, and the Dutch would then be able to do trade with a certain select group of merchants who served the royal court, and they were there for like 2 weeks, and then they had to go away again. And so that was the limitation on trade. So Japan was essentially cut off from the world for about 225 years. They were essentially just an insular society. They did not have any trade with the outside world. But in the 1850s, the United States Navy showed up, and Matthew Perry, who went on to famous, remember the cast of Friends, Admiral Matthew Perry sailed into, it was then Edo Harbor, Tokyo Harbor, and basically said, you need to open your country to trade or we're going to start blowing shit up. And just to show the Japanese what they had, they blasted a little fortress with their cannons and reduced it to rubble and said, hey, look what we can do, we've got cannons, and the Japanese were like, oh. And so basically Japan opened to the West. They began to trade with all the Western countries, the United States, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, etc., in the mid-1800s. This almost caused the collapse of Japanese society because the sudden influx of European guns and European books and European alcohol and European, everything almost overwhelmed, and then European manufactured goods and manufactured clothing, fabric, etc., almost overwhelmed the Japanese economy. And so in 1868, the emperor died, and basically a group of army officers staged something like a coup. They basically made sure that it wasn't the heir to the throne who became the next emperor, because he was a really conservative guy. They made sure that one of the younger brothers of the heir to the throne became the emperor because he was a very progressive guy. And then he named all these army officers to the top posts in the government, and then they set out on a plan. This is called the Meiji Restoration, but they set out on a plan to industrialize Japan in a hurry, because they by 1868, they can see England, France, what industrialization looks like. They can see the United States and how powerful it is. They can see how far behind they are.
What year was this?
1868. And so with the Meiji Restoration, they basically said, okay, we're going to send out observers, government observers. We're going to send thousands of young men off to American and European universities to get an education. And we're going to send commissions to go study manufacturing in France. And we're going to go study the law in Prussia. And we're going to go study medicine in Sweden. And we're going to go study, every aspect of everything. They basically just sent observers to everywhere in the world that was industrialized or industrializing, and said, we're going to bring back all the information we can. And then they basically sat down and said, well, this legal system looks like the most rational to us, so we're just going to adopt their legal system. And this industrial process, the Americans do this industrial process really well, so we're gonna copy the Americans on that industrial process, and we're gonna copy the Belgians on trains, and we're gonna copy the Swiss on banking, and we're gonna copy the, et cetera, et cetera. And so they basically, over the course of 30 years, the first several years after the Meiji Restoration, they're just observing the rest of the world. But then they basically set out to radically industrialize Japan. And they forcefully moved peasants off of farms into cities and set up factories and forced them to work in factories. And they built railroads just seized land and built railroads, plowing right through everything. They built factories, they built a navy, they built up an army, they sent military observers to go to military schools in the United States and Germany and wherever and come back and help them establish an army. And by 1895, they had essentially industrialized. They were the only country outside of Europe or the United States that had industrialized. Any questions? They then got into a war with China, and China was a much bigger country, to the tune of 10 times bigger, both geographically and population-wise. But they beat them. They beat China soundly in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. And then they got into a war with Russia in 1905, and they soundly beat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. And this was a real wake-up call for Europe. It's like, wait, Russia's a modern country with a modern army, and they're European, and Japan just beat them badly. And so people began to realize that Japan was a serious industrialized power now, a serious country. And then Japan basically decided that if it was copying Europe, it was going to copy Europe all the way. And the biggest way to copy Europe was to get colonies, because Europe had colonies. And so Japan basically said, okay, we need colonies. And in 1910, they basically took Korea. They conquered Korea and turned it into a colony. And then they began to look for ways to expand. But the problem they had was that most of Asia, aside from China, was under the control of Europeans, right? Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and Malaysia and Burma were British colonies, and India was a British colony, and et cetera, on and on. And the Philippines was Spanish until 1898, and then American after that. And so they basically realized if they wanted colonies, they were going to have to take them from the Europeans, but they also realized they were probably not strong enough to take them from the Europeans. So, the Japanese then decided that the only place they could really get colonies was from China. And so I want to point to this area up here. It's called, it's Manchuria. That says Manchuria, the smaller lettering. Manchukuo is the name of a country the Japanese would set up in a minute. So give me a minute. But basically, Japan has taken Korea in 1910. Korea is a Japanese colony, and they're eyeing Manchuria because Manchuria has a whole bunch of minerals, iron, coal reserves, etc. And so Japan really wants Manchuria for the natural resources. And so Japan in the 1930s, in particular, Japan, just like the rest of the world, got hit by the Depression. Right? The stock market crash rippled around the world, and Japan by 1932 was in a depression also with massive unemployment and economic downturns, etc. And the Japanese government decided the way to get out of that was to conquer a bunch of colonies and force them to buy Japanese products and take cheap natural resources from them, and basically this would jumpstart the Japanese economy. So, in, I believe it was 1934, Oh, 31, sorry. In 1931, the Japanese staged an international incident Manchuria was part of China. In fact, the ruling house of China was from Manchuria. And the Japanese, the Japanese have been investing in Manchuria for a while, and there is a Japanese railroad company that has built a railroad across Manchuria. And the railroad gets blown up. Somebody sets a bomb on the tracks and blows up the portion of the railroad. And we now know that it was the people who set the bomb was the Japanese military. But they used this as an excuse to say Manchuria is not protecting China is not protecting Japan's assets in Manchuria, and so Japan is going to send its military into Manchuria to secure Japan's assets there. So basically, they set up a crisis and used it as an excuse to invade Manchuria. And so they invade Manchuria and they take it over, and then they basically, at this point, China is a republic in name. It's very divided, but the last emperor of China had been deposed in 1912. He's still hanging around, and so the Japanese bring him in and install him as the emperor of Manchukuo, which is an independent country in Manchuria. But it's a puppet state. It's clearly, obviously, the Japanese have set up a puppet regime in Manchuria. And a big part of this was they simply were trying to jumpstart the Japanese economy by making Manchurians buy Japanese products and taking cheap raw materials from Manchuria for Japanese industry. I should point out, Japan is if you wanted to pick a country in the world that would be a great place to industrialize, Japan is not it. Japan has no reserves of iron or coal or any of the stuff you would industrialize with. So they are really based on imports. Any questions? Well, the Japanese did not want to stop at Manchuria. They wanted basically a huge chunk of China. In particular, they wanted to turn China into a colony. But China is big, and a lot of China, especially the western part of China, is not wealthy. It's just small peasants, and so most of the population in the big cities are along the coast. So in 1937, accidentally wrote the name of the Chinese dynasty instead of China. It's the Qing dynasty. But in 1937, Japan would. I'm going to switch maps on you here. It's a little hard to see, but basically, that's Russia up there. This is Mongolia. That's Manchuria. This is the South China Sea, and Japan's over there. Does that make sense?
Is Manchuria that whole thing?
No, Manchuria is basically, the border with Manchuria is up here.
Oh, okay.
And so this is Manchuria up here.
Okay.
And Mukden is where the railroad track was blown up.
Okay.
And this is Korea here. This is water. So basically, the border of Manchuria is pretty close to Peking, or Beijing. It's Peking on this map, you can't really see it, but the capital of China, Beijing, is right here, and the border between Manchuria and China runs right along there, right? Well, the Japanese decide to stage military exercises with the Manchurian government, joint military exercises. Everyone knows Manchuria is a Japanese puppet state here. So Japan and Manchuria staged joint military exercises right along the border with China, and Japan claims that one of their soldiers disappears. And they claim he's been kidnapped by the Chinese, and so they demand that the Chinese return him, and the Chinese are like, we don't know what you're talking about. And so the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incidents, because the bridge over the is a border river and there's a bridge over it, which is where this incident supposedly happened, the Japanese used that as an excuse to declare war on China in 1937 and simply invade China. And what they do is they very quickly spread down the coast of China, taking all the big cities are Peking and Nanjing and Hankou and Canton are all Shanghai, are all basically right along the coast here. And so what they're doing is just racing down the coast and grabbing all these cities. And their military is far superior to China's. China is has a very weak national government at this point, and a very corrupt national government at this point. So China is really not in a position to stop the Japanese very well. So the beginning of World War II in the Pacific is traditionally dated to the Marco Polo Bridge incident when the Japanese invade China in 1937.
Was the bridge called Marco Polo?
Yeah, it was called the Marco Polo Bridge. Because you have two people on each side and one go, Marco. I'm just kidding.
Don't joke about that.
So that map I just showed you, the Manchuria is up here, Beijing is right there. They basically have the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and they push down, and this map has a slightly different time frame than that map, so that's slightly different territory taken. But you can see the Japanese are pushed down to taking Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, all the big cities. They all would also take Canton, which is Guangzhou on that map. Any questions about that? So they basically take China, and the rest of the world scolds Japan firmly. Don't take China. Don't pick countries that aren't yours. But they don't do anything about it because France and Britain are totally occupied with Hitler in Europe because he's doing a bunch of threatening things, and they're really not paying attention. So the United States and Britain do start sending help to China and basically say, we'll send you some airplanes and some ammunition and some money. But China is really just holding on by its fingernails through 37, 38. Now, Japan does not just want China. Japan actually has a plan of creating this wonderfully named thing called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which I hope sounds better in Japanese. So Japan has this plan to create a Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, and they named it that because they're trying to make it sound like Japan is helping all the countries of Asia kick off the European yoke and achieve independence, and they'll all prosper together once they do that under Japanese leadership. But what that really means is we're going to take Europe's colonies and turn it into a Japanese empire, and we're going to exploit Europe exploit Asia just like the Europeans did. We're just going to call it the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere.
I just find it kind of funny how mad Europe got when Japan basically started doing the exact same thing that Europe had been doing for a long time.
I have a cartoon.
Then Europe just got mad about it, and it's like they did it first, and they did it more places.
There's a great cartoon that I have. It came out in the 1890s, I think. It might have been when the U.S. Took the Philippines, but I'm not sure. But it's a political cartoon, so it's just a cartoon drawing. But it shows a European in military uniform on top of a guy dressed in Asian clothes, and the European is pounding away on the guy, and the caption is civilization, and then the next frame is an Asian guy, the same Asian guy, on top of the European in military clothes, and he's just wailing away on him. It says barbarism. So the difference between civilization and barbarism is who's kicking whose ass, but it's all the same. Why?
Also, how dictatorships always have to get a democracy or republic in their name, just to make sure that nobody questions what they're actually up to.
Yeah.
It's okay because our name suggests otherwise.
Yes, exactly.
Because the National Socialists are definitely socialists.
Yes, and the People's Democratic Republic of Korea is totally democratic and a republic.
And for the people.
And the People's Republic of China is obviously democratic. Any questions? So, by 1939, Japan had basically solidified its control of a big chunk of China. Yep.
Going off that, and the Soviet Union was definitely very united.
Yes. So, by 1939, Japan had solidified control of the eastern, the Chinese seaboard, let's put it that way, and all the major industrialized cities. And Japan was basically trying to turn China into a colony. But they realized that although they wanted to conquer a whole bunch more of Asia, all the other bits were held by either the United States or European powers, which Japan didn't feel ready to take on. And in particular, on this map, Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, is a Dutch colony. Malaysia and Burma are a British colony, as is India over here. French Indochina included what we would today call Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And then the United States held the Philippines. And then there were a bunch of other island groups that were held. I mean, Hawaii is obviously held by the United States. Midway is held by the United States. But there's a bunch of other island groups down here that are held by European countries. So Japan wants to expand in there, but essentially, and Europe is not paying much attention. It's pretty obvious that Hitler is going to start something in Europe by 1938. It looks pretty obvious. And France and Britain are focused on that. But the United States is not engaged in Europe, and the United States is right there in the Philippines, and the United States is a big military power, much bigger than Japan. And so as long as the United States is there saying, nope, can't take anything, Japan can't really take anything. Any questions about that? All right. Meanwhile, back in Europe. One other aspect I want to mention on Japan is that Japan had a code of military conduct called Bushido. It's a philosophy of the warrior, if you will. You might call it the samurai code of behavior. Because it directly came out of the samurai tradition the Japanese samurai tradition is not that far off. I mean, obviously there are significant differences, but it's in the same ballpark as medieval European chivalry kind of thing, right? There are extreme rules about the etiquette of warfare and how you behave, etc. But one of the aspects of Bushido is the idea that the warrior, the samurai, must be ready at any moment to sacrifice himself for his lord, his daimyo, and really without question. And that surrender is never an option. Surrender is always a humiliation and a shame. And a true samurai would prefer to commit harakiri, which is killing himself, rather than surrendering, because the shame involves that. So if you've lost the battle and you're about to be taken prisoner, you're supposed to commit seppuku or harakiri, which is you basically kneel down and you have a friend standing behind you with a sword, and you take a sword and plunge it in your neck and you do a cross through your guts, and then your friend cuts your head off so you don't have to actually die from that stomach wound, which is going to be painful and take weeks. But you've killed yourself, because once you've done that wound, you're going to die. Your friend is just simply putting you out of your misery. And just as a side note, since I just mentioned that, when Japan surrenders at the end of World War I, the emperor ordered 2 Japanese diplomats to go sign the surrender on the USS Missouri, and you've all seen the pictures of Missouri, and it's on the deck of the ship, and the Japanese diplomats are showing up in tuxedos, and they're signing the document saying Japan surrenders. The diplomats only agreed to do that if they could commit harakiri afterwards. So they went right back to Japan and committed suicide, ritual suicide, because of the humiliation of surrendering for the whole nation. Any questions about that? And I will also point that Japan in the 1930s, as it was becoming more aggressive in foreign policy terms, had a process that we would call the militarization of society. That schools began to wear uniforms and students had to do marching, and all sorts and military officers got put into positions that are civilian government positions, like the Secretary of the Interior, or person in charge of the banking system is now a general. And the sort of idea that everybody had to be militarized and everybody had to take on the Bushido, the code of military, subordination, everyone had to be a good soldier for Japan, etc., really spread throughout Japanese society, and every part of Japanese society started to focus on these sort of military virtues and the code of Bushido and militarization of everything. And it had a close parallel to what the fascists were doing in Europe, in that, Mussolini and Hitler, etc., were essentially trying to militarize their societies and basically turn the Boy Scouts into a pre-army training program and et cetera. There's a lot of parallels there, and Japan is not the same, and I'm not sure it's useful to talk about fascism in Japan, but there's a whole lot of similarities between what's happening in Japan in the 1930s and what's happening in Germany and Italy in the 1930s.